Today's daf we're going to be learning is Sotah daf Lamed Zayin. We ended yesterday with a question. We had Yosef, and we compared Yosef and Yehuda. Yosef got one hey added to his name because he sanctified the name of God in secret in the story with Esha Potiphar, the wife of Potiphar. Yehuda now, not only, he doesn't even just get a hey, but his whole name includes the letters of the Shema Meforash, the special name of God. So on what account was he worthy of that? Now, obviously, he got named before this action happened. And it's not even him we're going to see, it's his tribe. But they're connecting what the greatness of Yehuda is to this story. In order to get to that story, we're going to have a very long braita with two opinions, one of them very well known and one of them less known, about what happened at Kriyat Yam Suf. So the first version is the less known one. Tanya, looking back at the bottom of Lamed Vav Amud Bet, we'll start from there. Hayam Rabbi Meir Omer, Kishamdu Yisrael al Hayam, when they were ready to cross the Red Sea, Hayu Shvatim Menatzchim Zeh Zeh, the tribes were all fighting with each other. What were they fighting about? Zeh Omer Ani Yored Tchila al Hayam, V'Zeh Omer Ani Yored Tchila al Hayam, as opposed to the version that is more familiar, which is nobody wanted to go in. They were all scared. This version has everybody wanting to go in, and they're fighting over who goes first. It's like fighting over who gets the front seat in the car, right? You know, who gets to go first? We all want to be first. Benjamin said, Shtuyot, this is silliness. What, you're all fighting? I'm just going in. And he dives into the water. Shnemal, where does this come from? So now we have to find some sort of verse to connect this to. We're going to find a verse in Tehillim. It says, Sham Binyamin Sa'ir Rodem. I'm going to read the continuation of it because in a minute we're going to darshan the rest of it. There, Binyamin was a young Rodem. We're going to have to explain what does Rodem mean. Sarei Yehuda Rigmatam. And the officers of Yehuda, Rigmatam, so the root of Rigmatam is Lirgom, like to stone, with stones, to throw stones at, pelt with stones. So what does this pasuk mean? And then it mentions Sarei Zvulun, Sarei Naftali. We're not going to darshan that at all. So what do they say? Al tikre rodem ela radyam. There, the rodem is a shortened version of two words. Often yuds and things like that fall off when you connect two words. So it's radyam. They went down into the water. What's this Sarei Yehuda Rigmatam? They were stoning them because they were very upset that Benjamin went first. What do you mean? We're Yehuda. We're the leaders. We're supposed to be first. Shenemal, Sarei Yehuda, Rigmatam, and that they get from that part. What's the reward that Benjamin gets for being the first to go in the water? He became the one who basically hosted God in his terrain. Shenemal, uven ktefav shachen. Okay, this is in the brachot that at the end of Sefer Dvarim that Moshe blesses the tribes. Says about Binyamin, that God dwells among his shoulders. What does this mean that God dwells in Binyamin? Well, there's a bunch of ways to understand it. The main way to understand, and there's a debate about this, there's a debate about whether Jerusalem was given as Nachalah in general to one of the tribes or not. Assuming that it was given, even though some say it's not, this obviously assumes it was divided, and particularly the temple was divided between Judah and Benjamin, okay? What do we have? But the best part of the temple, which is where God's presence rests, which is the Kodesh Kodashim, and the Heichal, the sanctuary, where the menorah and the shulchan and the Mizbach HaZahav is, and the Ulam, which leads to it. That all was in the tribe of Binyamin. Whereas the outer parts, the Harabayit, the Azarot, all that was in the domain of Yehuda, assuming that you go with the approach that it was given up out to the Shvatim. So that's one way of understanding this, that's what we're talking about. Others say not only that, but also the Mishkan was always in the tribe of Benjamin, which is in Nov, Giv'on, Shiloh, that was all in Binyamin's territory. So there's different ways to understand this, but either which way, it seems to relate to at least the temple and maybe other when the tabernacle went. So that's the first version. Amar lo Rabbi Yehuda. Interesting, by the way, that it's Rabbi Yehuda who says this, his name being Yehuda. Lo kachayama said that's not how it happened, right? We have a big debate about what exactly transpired there. Was it that everybody was fighting to go in and Binyamin just said, I'm doing it? Or Ela ze omer ein ani yored layam, v'ze omer ein ani yored layam. Nobody wanted to go in the water. They were petrified. Kafatz Nachshon ben Aminadav v'yarad layam tchila. Who goes in? Nachshon ben Aminadav, who is right from the tribe of Judah, which is again where we're going to get this from. How do we know this? Shenamar, we're now going to quote again. We have to have verses for this somewhere because it's not in the Torah. Well, in Sefer Hosea, one of the 12 books, Treasal, it says, Sivavuni bechachash Ephraim u'b'mirma Beit Yisrael, Yehuda od rad im el. Okay, so we have, you're going to surround me with the deceit of Ephraim and the lies of Ephraim and the deceit of the Jewish people. But Yehuda stands separate from all this. So Yehuda od rad im el. What does it mean, od rad im el? So basically they're explaining he went down into the water with God. That's how we understand rad im el, as opposed to everyone else. And then you have to explain it, not that they were deceitful, but that they didn't have belief in God is what it means. In other words, the other tribes didn't believe in God, that God was going to save them, but Yehuda did, and that's Yehuda went down with God. So down into the water. We have another pasuk from Tehillim, which proves this. Okay, the first pasuk we had in Tehillim was Tehillim Samachet, okay, which is 68. Now we're going to go to Tehillim Samachet, the next Tehillim, and we're going to see a reference to Yehuda. Hoshienu Elohim kibal mayim ad nafesh, tavati biyevein metzula ve'e ma'amad, v'chulei, al tishtefuni shibolet mayim va'al tibleuni metzula. This is God saved me because the water came up, right? I'm drowning basically. Tavati biyevein metzula, I'm drowned in deep mire, ve'e ma'amad, I can't stand. Al tishtefuni, don't let the water wash me away. Shibolet mayim va'al tibleuni metzula, and don't let the depths basically swallow me up. Okay, and they say that that's a reference to Yehuda, what Yehuda was praying when he got into the water. Botasha. Now, before we move on, I want to read some psukim, because you have to understand where the Midrash is coming from when they talk about these psukim. So, if you go to the story, and the simple version really matches this version, which is that nobody wanted to go into the water, because they start complaining to Moshe, and they say, what did you do to take us out of Mitzrayim? And you come to kill us in the desert. And, they get to the Yam Suf, the Mitzrayim are behind them. The Egyptians are chasing them. The water's in front of them. They have nowhere to go. And they start saying, right, and we should have better off staying in Egypt than dying in the desert. So Moshe says to them, don't worry, you're going to see the glory of God. I'm in chapter 14, verses 11, further up. Okay, so now going from there, says basically, don't worry, God is going to fight for you and you're going to come out on top. Then the next pasuk is Teva. Vayomer Hashem al Moshe. Hashem says to Moshe, after basically the people complain, Moshe says, don't worry, God is going to save you and get a grip. God says to Moshe something very strange. He says, Ma titzak ale Eli, why are you screaming to me? Now Moshe wasn't screaming to God according to the pasuk, right? Daber b'nei Israel v'yisal, speak to the Jewish people and go. Okay, and then it says, harem et matcha, right? Lift up your staff, nitei yadcha layam ubeka'eu. So put your staff down and split the waters. So what is this matitzak elai? So obviously what the Midrash often does is fills in details that seem to be missing, because obviously Moshe must have been screaming something to God. Now, what does it mean to scream to God? It means usually to pray. So we're still in this long braita. So they're standing in the sea. Nachshon is gone in. He's about to drown. And Moshe is sitting there praying. And God says to him, Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Yedidai tovim bayam v'atam ma'arich b'tfilah lefanai, an amazing line. He says, my friends are drowning at sea and you're praying? Like, there's a time and place for prayer, but this is not it. We have work to do. You can't just sit and pray and think that that's going to resolve everything. Now, obviously, right, we don't see Moshe praying in the text. That's what's very interesting. But from the fact that God says, why are you screaming to me? Must be that Moshe was praying to him. And basically God says, by the way, this phrase sounds very similar to, you think about it, when they say when the Jewish people sang, when the Mitzrayim drowned in the water and they were saved, there's a line, a very famous line, Ma'aseh yadai tovim bayam v'atem omrim shira. It's not appropriate to be singing when my creatures I created are dying. right? And we have to say this keep this in proportion, right? So this is similar. Now, notice the comparison. Masei Adai is those I created. Here it's Yedidai, my friends, right? The Jews are referred to as the friends of God. And basically, God is saying, they're drowning, and you're just praying to me? No way, no how. Get a grip. Amar lefanav, Ribbono shel olam, u'ma biyadi la'asot. So basically, right, Moshe says, what am I supposed to do? Like, I don't understand. The water's here. Like, to me, the most logical thing is to pray. So, Amar lo, dabero b'nei Yisrael v'yisau. So then the pasuk continues and says, this is what you should do. Speak to the Jewish people and tell them, just go, and you take your staff, put it on the water, and the waters will split. Okay, leficha. Okay, so now we're back to, that was an aside. Now we're back to the Judah story, right? And Yehuda got rewarded for this. So what did he get rewarded for? Leficha, the same way we had the Binyamin, and what was Binyamin's reward because of what they did. So now we're going to have what was Yehuda's reward? They became the kings of Israel. How do we know it's connected to Kriyat Yam Suf, to the splitting of the sea? Shene'amar, another famous pasuk. In Hallel, we say this, B'tzei Yisrael miMitzrayim, Hayta Yehuda lekodsho, Yisrael mam shalotav. Judah became sanctified, Yisrael mam shalotav. They rule over Israel. Matam Hayta Yehuda lekodsho, Yisrael mam shalotav. How did they become the ruler? What's the next word? Mishum dehayam ra'av ayanos, because the water saw and ran. Because of Yehuda that got into the water. So on account of the splitting of the Red Sea, they were rewarded by getting the rulership. That was all to answer the question of Yehuda. Where did we see that Yehuda was Mekadesh Shem Shamayim? And now we're moving on to a different topic. What topic are we on? Back to what we keep getting sidetracked from, the Levites and the whole blessing and curses that go on Har Grizim and Har Eival, and how did it all come about? So we're back to the issue of Shevet Levi. If you remember, and I know, Becky, you were bothered by this, we're going to have more of it today, although this will be it. How could it be that Shevet Levi was on the mountain and Shevet Levi was in between? So we're going to have two descriptions and then a third totally different description of everything, different than we've been thinking until now. Until now, we keep saying 6 were on top of the mountain. Again, not at the very top. They were facing the mountain from a lower point on the mountain. 6 tribes were on the other side doing the same thing. Each was facing their own mountain from a bit of a lower point. And in the middle, in the valley in between the two mountains, was the Kohanim and the Levites. We already learned yesterday that some of the Levites were at the top, some were at the bottom. Now, how did they figure out who was where? We're going to have 2 opinions for that. And then, as I said, one opinion that understands this whole thing a little bit differently. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. So we're in a braita now, Tanya. So Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, you can't say Levi was at the bottom because there already says that they were at the top. You can't say they were at the top because it already says they were at the bottom. So how does this work? The elders of the Kohanim and the Levites were at the bottom. Okay, elders, I don't think they mean the old people. They mean the significant, the important people. Makes sense because they're the ones who are going to call out the blessings and the curses. You want the most respected of the community. And hash'al lemala. So basically you take the best or the most prominent of the Kohanim and Leviim and they're at the bottom. Everybody else goes up to the top. Rabbi Yoshiya, different opinion. Anyone who could work from ages 20 to 50, you could do work as Kohanim and Leviim. Those who could work because they were carrying the Aron, that was their job here. So those who could work were at the bottom. Hash'ar, everyone else who wasn't in that age range and wasn't male, all went up to the top. But as I said, we're going to have this third opinion, totally different opinion about how the whole thing worked. Rabbi Yismael, elu be'elu lamata hemumdim. Actually, everybody was at the bottom. He's not specifically relating to the Shevet Levi issue. But what he's saying is, when it says these are on Har Eival and these are on Har Grizim, nobody hiked up to the top of the mountain. That's not what we're talking about. Everybody stood at the bottom of the mountain. So 6 tribes stood at the bottom of Har Grizim, and 6 stood at the bottom of Har Eival. Now we're going to have to understand the pasuk, right? It says al, it went on the mountain. On the mountain means the top, or at least close to the top or somewhere near the top. So we'll get to that in a minute. And then how did it work? Now it seems to be they're talking about the people in the middle, the Kohanim and the Leviim who are in the middle. So then they started with the brachot, and they turned to Har Grizim, and then they started with the curses, and they turned to Har Eival, right? So that's patchu b'bracha. They looked to Har Grizim and started with the bracha, and then klapei Har Eival upatchu b'klala. So now they ask, my al. So then what's this al? Because these tribes were al Har Grizim and al Har Eival, means on. They say al b'samuch. Al means next to. Okay, now you might say, what do you mean? The word al means on top of. So we're now going to prove it from a braita, that al could mean next to. Kidetani, as it says in a braita, v'natata al hama'arechet levonazaka. This is talking about the lechem apanim. There were 6 loaves on one called the ma'arechet, and 6 loaves in the other. So there were these 12 loaves in 2 sections, and it says on each ma'arechet you put levonazaka, you put frankincense. And it sounds like it's saying on top of, but it's not. Rebbi Omer al b'samuch. Rebbi says al means next to. You put the frankincense next to each of the sets of the 6 loaves, each row of loaves. Ata omer al b'samuch oenu el al mamash. So now they ask, is it really b'samuch? Maybe it really meant on top of. Kishu omer v'sakota al ha'aron. Now they bring another pasuk to prove it. It says, and they put on the aron the parochet. What's the parochet? Like we have on the aron kodesh. Parochet is a curtain. You don't put the curtain on top of the aron. You put a curtain in front of the aron. That's how it functions. So heve omer al b'samuch. That proves that al could be understood as next to. So that's how we resolved Rebbi, who has this whole unique interpretation of the way it all went down, that instead of being at the top of the mountain, they actually stood at the foot of the mountain. Continuing on, now we're going to talk about the fact that there was some sort of covenant created with the people at the time. Okay, now before we do this, I want to read a few verses. So the first thing I want to read is something we're going to get back to later, but I may as well mention it now, once we're in the verses. So the first time the brachot and the klalot get mentioned is in Dvarim Yud Aleph. It's a pasuk we saw before where it describes where they're going to do this. Ba'arava, mul, right, we derech mavo hashemesh be'eretz Knani, Oshe ba'arava, mula Gilgal, etzel elonim arei. We saw that whole thing. That's from Yud Aleph. But here's the real mention of it. Okay, so the pasuk before says, "Vayakiv Hashem elokecha la'aretz asher tabasham l'ishta." Okay, when God brings you to the land that you inherited. I mean, verse 29. V'natata et bracha al Har Grizim ve'et klala al Har Eival. You're going to do the bracha on Har Grizim and the klala on Har Eival. And then it tells you where these places are. That's it. Very small mention of it. Fast forward to Dvarim Kaf Zayin, and there it says, Vayitzav Moshe et ha'am bayom ahu lemor, verse 11. Moshe commands the people to say, Eile yamdu levarech et ha'am al Har Grizim ba'avrachem et hayarden. These are the people who are going to stand to bless the people on Har Grizim when you cross the Jordan, and then it lists Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Yosef, Binyamin. And Eli Yamdu ala Kala b'Har Eival, and these are the 6 that are going to stand on the curse at Har Eival. Ruvain, Gad, Asher, Zvulun, Dan, Naphtali. V'anu Leviim v'amru al Kol Ish Yisrael Kol Ram. Okay, and then you have a list of all the arurs. Remember, it just says arur; it doesn't say baruch at all, even though we learned that they also said baruch. And the first one is about the Pesel and Masecha that we've seen already. The last one is this very general one called arur shelo yakim et divrei Torah azot la'asot otam va'amar kol ha'am amen. Okay, arur is the one who doesn't keep the words of the Torah, a very general line. Okay, whereas everything else is very specific. There's a whole list of very specific curses for all sorts of sins. Anyway, then it goes to this divrei Torah. Okay, then we have right after that is all the blessings of the curses, which are more detailed. Like we read a long thing about if you listen to the mitzvah, all these good things will happen to you. And if you don't listen to God, then all these bad things are going to happen. There's a whole long description of all these curses, the things that are going to come upon you. And then it ends with Elu divrei habrit asher tziva Hashem et Moshe aman Kafchet 28:69. Okay, the last pasuk in the section. These are the words of the covenant that God commanded Moshe, Lechlot et bnei Israel be'eretz Moav, to create this brit with God, with the people in Moav, milvad abrit asher karati tam b'chorev. In addition to the brit that he had already done with them in Chorev, which is understood to be Sinai. So we're going to talk about all this soon. Okay, the brit isn't mentioned specifically with the brachot and klalot. But it is mentioned after this section about Moshe. Now remember, the brachot and kalot are going to happen in the time of Joshua, not in the time of Moshe. So right now, the Gemara is assuming, even though it doesn't say so, that there was also a brit, a covenant formed with the Jewish people at the brachot and the kalot with Joshua. We'll see later that's a subject of debate. So let's start now at the bottom of Amud Aleph. So Tanu Rabbanan. Gemara starts off by saying the following. First, they're going to start about that general pasuk where it says Aror shelo yakim et divrei Torah, where it's this general curse. Baruch bichlal, baruch biprat. Aror bichlal, aror biprat. So the first thing they want to tell you is that we're going to play a big numbers game here. With every curse, like let's say you do a pesel ha'masecha, okay? So you were cursed if you do a pesel ha'masecha, and you're also getting a curse for Aror shelo yakim et divrei Torah, because the divrei Torah, that last pasuk, is really connected to every single other pasuk, both in the curse and in the blessing. Because remember, even though it only lists curses there, it also was understood that there was a blessing for each one. So basically, even though it doesn't seem like they repeated at the end of every curse, they also said the general one, but it's as if by every mitzvah here, there's an Arur and a Baruch, and there's the specific and there's the general, because the general covers all of them. So already, instead of one curse, you now have that one curse is really 4 curses and blessings, okay? It's become doubled because of the blessings and quadrupled because each one also includes that general pasuk. Now we're going to multiply that number by 4. Why? Because when it comes to each of those mitzvot, which we now have an Arur and a Baruch and a Klal and a Prat, well, we also have, and Rashi quotes this, if you look in about the middle of the page in Rashi, even though we're at the very end of the daf, you'll see that right after that, the next, it says, the rest of the Perush of Rashi on this page really belongs on the next page. Okay, the problem is, I don't know, they had a printing issue, I don't know why, but it's like toward a little below the middle of the page, all the mitzvot need these 4. Because ulamadetem otam, you're supposed to teach them. You're supposed to learn them. Ushmartem lasotam, and you should observe them to do them. Uchtiv ulamadetem otam b'nechem, and it says you should teach them to your children. So you end up with 4 verbs, 4 actions related to each mitzvah. So that's basically 4 times 4. We get to 16. The Gemara is going to say it in a bit of a strange way. I would just say 4 times 4 equals 16. They say it in the following way. I'm turning now to Amud Bet. Hare arba. Arva ba'arba hare shmone. In other words, we're going to have 4 for each one. Then 4 for limod ulilamed. For limod, you have to learn them. And then 4 for lilamed. That's already 8. And then shmone ushmone. Then we have another 8, which is lishmor v'lasot hare sheshet. So we get to 16. V'chein b'Sinai v'chein ba'Arvot Moav. And not only that, but they accepted them here, which is a later time in history, right? In the time of Joshua. They also, and that was a brit, basically, of 16. And now in Sinai also, they accepted the Torah, and also in Arvot Moav, because we saw in Arvot Moav, in that pasuk we saw in chapter 28, Shenemar elu divrei brit asher tziva Hashem et Moshe, etc., right? And milvad brit asher karati tam b'chorev. So we had in that pasuk, Moshe had them accept the Torah, and they had already accepted it with Moshe before at Sinai. And then we have this accepting of the Torah in the time of Yoshua. And it said, you have to keep this brit. Okay, that's also a pasuk in Varim Kaftet. Anyway, we see there we have, now we're going to get to Nimtza Mem Chet Britot Al Kol Mitzvah Mitzvah. We now have on every mitzvah 48 britot, because why? 16 for the ones in the klalot, right? The brachot and the klalot. Multiply that by the Sinai, right? By 3, Sinai and Arvot Moav. There was an acceptance of all the commandments. There was a brit, 48 britot, because 16 at the brachot and klalot, multiply that by 3, and you get to 48. Rabbi Shimon understands it differently. Motzi Har Grizim B'Har Eival. He says that wasn't a brit, that wasn't a covenant. It's never mentioned covenant there. Umachnis ohel moed shabamidbar. Says, I still agree with you that there's 48, but it was all with Moshe. It was at Sinai. It was at ohel moed. Where at ohel moed? Well, at the end of Sefer Shemot, God's presence is revealed in ohel moed. And the next pasuk of Vayikra, it starts off with, you can see Rashi quotes this, V'yidaber Hashem elav me'ol moed lemol. Okay, so it says there in Vayikra chapter 1, okay, it says that God, in that chapter, it says God spoke to him from ohel moed, which was a different way that God had spoken to him before. And they say that now that God was speaking from ohel moed in a more direct manner, so then there was a reacceptance of the Torah. Okay, so basically he says, Sinai, ohel moed, and Arvot Moav. Brachot and kalot don't count. Why not? So Rashi explains the problem with the brachot and kalot is because it didn't say all the mitzvot. It's just a list of certain mitzvot. It's not all of them. So because it's not all of them, that's not considered an acceptance of the whole Torah. Okay, so therefore he takes it off the list. So we basically have this machloket. Tanakama says it is on the list, and Sinai is one, and we don't have ohel moed. So we have Sinai, Arvot Moav, right before they're about to get into the land, when they're still with Moshe, and Joshua when they get into the land. Rabbi Shimon says get rid of Joshua, Sinai, ohel moed, and Arvot Moav. So now they point out, but plugdi dahani tonight. The machloket between them is the same machloket as we have these Tanaim arguing about. It's actually based on, it's kind of saying this machloket is based on that machloket, and they're going to line up. How so? Ditanya, Rabbi Yismael omer, klalot ne'emru b'Sinai, upratot ba'ol moed. Rabbi Yismael says, at Sinai, they didn't really get all the mitzvot. They just got general rules. And in ohel moed, they got all the details. So that means that ohel moed and Sinai are counted as one covenant because one is just explaining the other. So Sinai and ohel moed go together. That's Tanakama, who only lists Sinai once, and then lists Arvot Moav and the brachot and klalot. Rabbi Akiva omer, klalot upratot ne'emru b'Sinai, v'nishnu ba'ol moed, v'nishtalshu b'Arvot Moav. Rabbi Akiva says, no, they got everything at Sinai, details and general principles. Then it was all repeated at ohel moed, and it was all repeated at Arvot Moav, which basically means that those are the three, and then you wouldn't have the one, right? He doesn't relate to the fact that the ones in Joshua are not included, but it would make sense if, assuming there must have been some tradition about this 48 britot, these 48 covenants that were done, and therefore he ends it there. Well, ein lecha davar u'mitzvah u'mitzvah, אין לך דבר מצווה ומצווה שכתובה בתורה שלא נכרתו עליה 48 בריתות. So Rabbi Akiva says, so there isn't any mitzvah in the Torah that didn't have these 48 britot, covenants. Now, this wasn't confusing numbers-wise yet. Now it's going to get a little more confusing because they're going to say the following. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda ish kfar Akko amar mishum Rabbi Shimon. Okay, so he says in the name of Rabbi Shimon, אין לך מצווה ומצווה שכתובה בתורה שלא נכרתו עליה 48 בריתות, what he's saying is, for those 48 covenants were accepted by 603,550 people. So multiply those numbers, and then you get to really how many britot there were, because that was the amount of people that were in the desert at the time. And therefore, we get to this much bigger number. We're going to explain this a little better in another 2 minutes, what this means. I'm a Rebbi. Rebbi says, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda ish kfar Akko shamar mishum Rabbi Shimon. He concludes something different from what the other person just said. So far, that was just a quote. But nimtza, from here you can see, for every single person in Israel, each person in Israel took upon themselves 603,550 covenants, or maybe times 48. Okay, unclear. But my benayu, what's the difference between them and what are we talking about? Okay, I struggled a little to understand this fully, but I'll try my best. Rabbi Yoshiya, Arva va'arva da'arva ika benayu. Arva is an arev, a guarantor. So what they seem to be saying is the difference between them is a guarantor for the guarantor for the guarantor. Okay, what does that mean? So according to the first interpretation, the assumption is that everybody took on this covenant for themselves, and what we say, Kol Yisrael arevim ze bazeh, everyone is there out there for everybody else. They also have to guarantee everybody else keeping the commandments. So everybody took on the brief for themselves and for all 603,550 people. So they basically took it on for themselves and committing to be a guarantor so that everyone else keeps the mitzvah. According to the second opinion, everyone took upon themselves the mitzvot, to be a guarantor for everyone else, and to be a guarantor for everyone else who is a guarantor for everybody else. So basically, if you're guaranteeing someone else, I'm guaranteeing you for guaranteeing somebody else. So that gets the number up a lot more. I didn't get into what the actual numbers are and how much that means, but we'll leave it at that. Okay, that was just the end of that braita that we were quoting about. I believe we were still in that braita of Rabbi Yismael and Rabbi Akiva and how many britot, and then we got into these other numbers. Tarash Rabbi Yehuda ben Nachmani mitorgamanei de Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. So now this Rabbi Yoshiya ben Nachmani, who is the Torgaman of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, said the following: Kol parasha kula, all the brachot and the klalot, lo ne'emra ela b'noef v'noef. They're all talking about committing adultery, okay? Inappropriate sexual relations. Now you have to look at the list and see. Some of them actually relate directly to it, but some of them don't at all. Let's go with the one we keep seeing. Peselu masecha, right? What does that have to do with a noef and noef? That has to do with worshiping idols. So how does he explain this? Aruch ha'ish asher yaseh peselu masecha. Ba'arur sagilei? Wait, someone who builds idols, what, it's enough to just curse him? What do you mean? That's a very serious offense. That's basically denying the entire religion, right? It's all based on belief in God and not idols. You know, it's a little bit different than adultery. Not to say adultery isn't quite serious and quite horrible, but theoretically, I mean, you might claim you really don't believe in God if you commit adultery, but, you know, it's not against God's per se, and it's not against our entire religion. It's just a horrible thing to do. But therefore, what does he say? When it says arur asher, yes, arur ha'ish, that makes a pesel masecha, it's really saying haba al harava, someone, arur, this person who slept with a woman he wasn't supposed to sleep with, v'holid ben, and had a child, v'halach lebein ovdei kochavim, this son, because he was born from this inappropriate relationship, ends up going off the derech, okay, ends up going to be among idol worshippers, and ends up worshiping idols. Right? The worst thing we want to hear as parents, right? It's all your fault. Okay, so you're the ones who get cursed because you're the one who caused him to do this because of your sin from the beginning. His whole being coming into life was out of sin, and that caused him later in his life to sin. Tanu Rabbanan, last section for today. And this relates to, this is why when we got to the Psukim, I kind of set it all out to begin with, which is we have Perek Yud Aleph, which says you're supposed to give the bracha at Har Grizim and the klala at Har Eival. And then it says the same thing in chapter 27. So they want to know when it says V'natata et bracha at Har Grizim v'at klala b'Har Eival in chapter 11, what's it teaching you? In l'lamed shtei bracha al Har Grizim u'klala al Har Eival, if they want you to know that the bracha is going to be on Har Grizim and the klala is on Har Eival, again, it's not kfar already, but it means it's already said somewhere else in the Torah in chapter 27. So there's no reason to mention that in chapter 11. It's repetitive because it already says, Elu yamdu levarech et ha'am al har grizim, uchtiv ve'elu yamdu al klala b'har eival. So it says, these will stand on the bracha and har grizim, this will stand on the klala. So basically, the whole, which one goes with the bracha, which one goes with the klala is already stated in Farim 27. You don't need it to be said in Farim Yud Aleph. So they say, Ella, to teach you a whole bunch of things. Number one, notice it says you're going to give the bracha at Har Grizim and the klala at Har Eival. Now remember, in the Torah, when it talks about the bracha and klala, it only says the curses. So it's to tell you, Ella lagdim bracha leklala. It's to tell you that first you say the bracha, then you say the klala. That's what the pasuk in Devarim is teaching. In Devarim 11 is teaching you. First start with the bracha, then say the klala. Maybe you're supposed to do first the whole list of brachot and then the whole list of klalot. No. Bracha uklala. That's why it says bracha and klala. Bracha achat kodemet leklala ve'en kol brachot komot leklala. Meaning, do 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. Bracha klala, bracha klala, bracha klala, bracha klala. Don't do all the brachot and then all the klalot. Okay. Pretty like their neck, I can imagine, right? Turning this way, turning that way, turning this way, turning that. Okay. Now they say the following. Not only that, but it's also coming to teach you, because it says give the bracha here and the klala there. This is what we call a hekesh. We're going to learn that what's true for the klala is also true for the bracha, since all we really know about is the klala, because the details are all given about the klalot. So, right, if you just read Dvarim and you don't have what we're talking about, you think all they're doing is saying curses there. Again, it does say you say the bracha, but then the text is all curses. So, lakish bracha l'klala loma l'cha. So it's again, we're going to learn everything about the brachot from what we know about the klalot. So number one, ma klala b'leviim, af bracha b'leviim. Who says them? Just like the Levites say the curses, the Levites also say the bracha. Ma klala b'kol ram, af bracha b'kol ram. If you remember, it said there, it has to be said out loud. So since that has to be said out loud, also the brachot have to be said out loud. Ma klala b'lashon hakodesh, af bracha b'lashon hakodesh. Just like the curse is in Hebrew, the bracha has to be in Hebrew. Ma klala b'chlal uprat, af bracha b'chlal uprat. Just like the curses have the specific and also the general one, also the bracha has the specific and also that general one we saw at the end, which we already said relates to every single one. Uma klala elu ve'elu onim amen. Just like by the curse, everyone answers amen at the end of them. Af bracha elu ve'elu onim amen. Right? It's not just the people standing on the side of the brachot answer amen to the bracha, but everybody answers amen to the brachot as well. So we just saw a list of halachot that we're going to learn from the klalot to the brachot, and that's why the whole section in Dvarim Yud Aleph is mentioned. Okay, so the next mission we're not going to start today. We're going to go deal with Berkot Kohanim, which was, if you remember, in the very first mission of the chapter was, here are the things that have to be said that can be said in any language. Here are the things that have to be said in Hebrew. Berkat Kohanim is next on the list. So we're going to go all into all sorts of interesting things about Berkat Kohanim. If you're a Kohen, you'll particularly like the stuff. Even if not, it's interesting, very relevant things. Okay, quick review of the daf. So we started with this question of Yehuda, and we said Yehuda, where was he Kadesh Shem Shamayim, and therefore was Zocher for this, having the name of God in his name. Right, again, even though his name came first, we discussed that already. And we saw from the Nachshon ben Aminadav story. Within that, we saw all sorts of other things about Kriyat Yam Suf. Number one, there was an opinion that everybody wanted to go in, but Binyamin kind of took the lead, and that's why they ended up in the Mikdash in their territory. Then we had the opinion that was Nachshon, and that really nobody wanted to go in. And then Moshe got reprimanded for trying to pray when he really should have been acting, right? Which teaches us an interesting lesson that sometimes the right answer is to pray, but not always, right? Taking action is sometimes much more significant. And then we started with Shevet Levi. We had two opinions of how they split Shevet Levi, who was going to be at the top, who was going to be at the bottom. And then we saw this unique interpretation that actually nobody was at the top. Everybody was at the bottom. Those at the foot of that mountain, those at the foot of that mountain. We used al to prove that al could be samuch. We saw that in other places. Then we talked about how many britot they had on that day, at least according to the person who says the word britot on that day. And there were 48. And then, right, there were 48 altogether. There were 16 then, and then multiplied by 3 because in Sinai, and then in Arvot Moav. And then we had the other opinion that no, it was Sinai, ohel moed, and Arvot Moav. And that was based on this machloket about whether you think that in ohel moed, they received exactly what they received in Sinai, or in ohel moed, was it the details? And in Sinai, it was the generalities, in which case that's all viewed as one. And then we moved on to this, and we had this extra thing about the 603,550 people that were in the desert. Were they each taking upon themselves guaranteeing everyone else, or were they guaranteeing everyone else's guarantee as well? And then we moved to these last 2 points, which was one, that according to Rabbi Yehuda ben Nachmani, all the klalot have to do with noef and noefet, which, by the way, connects to our Masechet and how bad noef and noefet and how it has ramifications to the children. And it's really talking about someone who does that will have children who will go astray, and then they're being cursed for what their children will do. And then we had why does it appear also in Yud Aleph, when all the details in Yud Aleph are really repeated in all the details in chapter 11 in Dvarim are repeated in chapter 27. And for that, we learned 2 main things. One is that the bracha preceded every curse, and that all the details about the klalot that we know about, and that was a whole list of details, are true also for the brachot as well. With that, we finish our daf today, wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and a Pesach Sheni Sameach.